So I was recently interviewed for a Washington Post article that looked at the science of carbohydrate loading and marathon running, and it does a great job of covering the basics. But in this video, I wanted to go into more detail in terms of the actual science that underpins the recommendations to carbohydrate load for marathoning and talk a little bit about what are the factors that really dictate how much carbohydrate you might want to consume leading up to a marathon. So as we go through the science on carbohydrate loading, we're really going to rely on two main studies for our discussion. The first one is a meta-analysis by Jose Irita and Will Hopkins, published in Sports Medicine, that looked at the factors that impact glycogen storage. So think carbohydrate storage in the muscle. Glycogen is our storage form, and we've got only so much that we can hold in muscle. It's not infinite. And especially relative to fat, it's going to be a lot less. So that was one sort of goal of that paper. The other was to look at how certain factors impact the utilization of glycogen and how fast that happens. So the first graph we're going to take a close look at in this study is showing the effect of fitness and diet on muscle glycogen content. You see on the horizontal axis, we have fitness levels. We've got 40 for the lowest group, which would be kind of somebody who's healthy but not particularly trained. We've got 70 for the highest group. That's kind of approaching more of an elite type athlete. And then on the vertical axis, we have muscle glycogen content or concentration. And it's expressed sort of as millimoles per kilogram of dry mass. Just think of it as concentration, how much glycogen is packed within the skeletal muscle. And the other thing that this graph shows is the effective diet. So within each of those bars, you've got different shaded regions. We have basically the white regions on the bottom, which show what would be typical glycogen concentrations for athletes who are eating a relatively low carbohydrate diet. We've got the gray in the middle, which is kind of normal or typical dietary intake among athletes. And then the black top part of those bars shows what happens when you really up the carbohydrate consumption, sort of like a carbohydrate loading type protocol. What are the amounts we're talking about here? So for the low carbohydrate, we're thinking somewhere around 3 grams per kilogram of body mass or less. For the middle intake, we're thinking maybe something like 5 grams, upwards of 6 grams of carbohydrate for every kilogram of your body mass. And then the high intake would be 7 and above, maybe between 7 and 10 grams of carbohydrate per kilogram of body mass. So what you see is that fitter athletes tend to have more glycogen, and that's for a couple reasons. They probably are eating more carbohydrate, but their body also has a better ability to synthesize and make carbohydrate. And then the other thing is that increasing dietary carbohydrate intake is going to raise glycogen levels. Upwards of doubling, if you look at an athlete who's got a pretty low intake of carbohydrate and then going through a sort of carbohydrate loading protocol, they may double the concentrations of glycogen that they have in their skeletal muscle. Now, I know the grams per kilogram of body mass units might be a little bit confusing, but just think of it as a relative number that we want to kind of account for people of different body sizes. So for me, for example, I'm a little bit under 80 kilograms. So if I'm on a normal carbohydrate intake for a runner, maybe around 5 grams per kilogram of body mass, we're looking at 400 total grams in a day for that level of intake. If I really upped my intake, let's say to 8 grams per kilogram of my body mass, take 8 times 80, we get 640 total grams of carbohydrate intake in a day. So the next interesting figure in this meta-analysis is showing the interaction between exercise intensity and starting glycogen levels and how fast you're going to sort of run out, based on the duration and intensity of what you're doing. And what you see here is starting levels of glycogen at 400. So think kind of typical background diet, nothing exceptional. And what you see is the higher the exercise intensity you do, the faster you go through that glycogen. So, what are we doing when we think about a marathon? Well, it depends on the caliber of athlete, but the kind of average marathoner who's not particularly elite might be completing that race at 70% of their VO2 max, as an example. So let's look at that 70% of VO2 max line in this graph. After 100 minutes, you're starting to get levels of glycogen that are significantly low. Now, maybe not completely empty in those muscle fibers, but low enough where it may impact performance. And that's because you don't necessarily have to have complete degradation or complete depletion for there to be some negative effects. Now, what you can see here is that for lower exercise intensities, if you're exercising at something like 60% of VO2 max or lower, you're not going to run out of glycogen as fast in those scenarios. Even if you've got kind of this just typical glycogen starting level with a normal background diet, you may not have to worry as much about actually running through those stores. So the next figure here shows kind of the same concept, but let's up the carbohydrate intake. Let's double the glycogen level and see what happens to this effect of exercise intensity on depletion of glycogen or degradation of glycogen. What you see here is, again, with exercise intensity, the higher it is, the faster you go through that glycogen. But let's stick with the 70% example. If you compare this graph to the last one, what you see noticeable is that you're able to go a longer time before you sort of get to the same level of depletion. So you're extending that time where you can utilize carbohydrate, and that generally correlates with less fatigue or less slowing down because carbohydrate is a more efficient fuel than fat. So the longer you can go without running out of glycogen, the longer you can sustain muscular contraction at a given rate and a running speed at a given intensity. So the main point here is that muscle glycogen is going to impact how long you can go before you start to potentially have issues with fatigue. Now, it's not the only thing. Of course, there are many other factors that play a role in when an athlete maybe hits the wall or slows down in a marathon, but what's available in the muscle in terms of carbohydrate is going to be one of those factors that plays a significant role. All right, so the next study we're going to take a look at here is sort of looking at the metabolic factors that limit marathon performance by Benjamin Rappaport, who published this over 10 years ago while he was at Harvard. Currently actually appears to be a neurosurgeon, but at the time he was sort of interested in carbohydrate, its effects on marathon performance, and when it may become a limiting factor in athletes' success in that event. So it's basically a simulation study or a modeling study where he takes some known variables, thinking like muscle glycogen levels, how hard an athlete is working, their fitness level, and modeling at what point they might start to hit a wall during the marathon because of glycogen depletion. So the first thing I want to take a look at in this paper is actually in the text. So there's this formula, this CDM formula, and basically it's kind of calculating the total energetic cost of completing a marathon. And what plays into that is a couple of things. So C stands for cost of running. So for a given kilometer, how much energy is it going to take that athlete to, cover that distance? D is the distance of the race. So in this case, we know the distance of a marathon. And then M is mass, because a person's mass is going to play a role in bioenergetics and how much energy they're using for a given type of exercise. So looking at those variables, we can sort of calculate what is the total energetic cost. In this example that he has in the paper, we're looking at over 2,900 calories to cover the distance of a marathon. Now, more germane to the discussion of carbohydrate is this next formula that sort of shows that the amount of carbohydrate you need to consume or to eat before a marathon and during a marathon is dependent on the relative exercise intensity, meaning what percentage of your VO2 max are you going to be able to sustain during the race? What fraction of your VO2 max? The higher the fraction of your VO2 max you can sustain, the more carbohydrate you're going to end up using, and the more total carbohydrate you need to onboard before the race and perhaps consume during the race. So this other graph here is showing the relationship between exercise intensity, relative exercise intensity as a percentage of VO2 max, and then carbohydrate and fat burning, the contribution from each of those. And you can see as exercise intensity goes up, especially as you're getting above 75, 80% of VO2 max, majority of your energy is derived from utilizing carbohydrate. So that's a big factor in determining the relative value of carbohydrate loading. Depends on how good the athlete is or what level of effort they're going to give during the marathon. If it's going to be an attempt to PR, and especially if that athlete is high caliber, they're able to sustain a high level of their VO2 max for the entire race, they're going to need more carbohydrate. The average runner might be able to sustain 70% of their VO2 max for a marathoner. An elite runner, thinking about world record type setting athlete, 90% or more, in some cases, they can sustain that level of effort for the entire race. A well-trained high-level runner might be more in kind of the 80% territory. So that's going to be a big determinant here as it relates to the total amount of carbohydrate that an athlete needs to get in before the race, and again, perhaps also during the race itself. So there's another graph in this article that does a nice job of kind of outlining the practical aspects of this information in an actual marathon. So what you see here is on the horizontal axis, a representation of relative effort during the marathon as a percentage of VO2 max. And then what you see are these colored lines dropping down through the graph. And essentially what those are telling us is for different levels of muscle glycogen and different levels of dietary carbohydrate intake, where would we maybe expect there to be a high probability of hitting the wall during the marathon? At what distance? So distance is on the vertical axis. So what you'd want to do with this graph is you find the relative effort of the athlete. So let's say 70% of VO2 max, because that's, again, maybe a typical runner who is not, super elite or very highly trained. And if you draw a vertical line up from 70% and see where it intersects that curve. So let's start with the red line that represents low glycogen or relatively low dietary carbohydrate intake. Where the vertical line intersects with that red line, we then draw horizontally over to the labels on the vertical axis, and we see what distance approximately we would expect to have a high probability of hitting the wall. And in this case, with relatively low muscle glycogen levels to start out with, at 70% of VO2 max, we're expecting to hit the wall maybe around something like mile 21. So well short of when the marathon is going to finish. Now let's take an example of a high-level athlete who's exercising maybe at 90% of their VO2 max. So that's in the sort of the very high-level elite type category. So we draw a vertical line up to the red curved line and then over, and we see around halfway through the marathon is when they're going to really start to have significantly low glycogen levels. So clearly not enough to get them through that race without some major issues with fatigue. Now, what about more kind of typical glycogen levels for an athlete who's eating a decently high amount of carbohydrate intake? That's represented by the yellow line in the middle of those bunch of curved lines. So we can kind of do the same thing. We can draw vertical lines up from the horizontal axis for different relative efforts. And then we can see essentially where we expect there to be some potential issues with hitting the wall, again, with respect to muscle glycogen levels during the course of the marathon, at what distance. So in this example, we can kind of see for 70% of VO2 max, for a sort of typical, relatively high carbohydrate diet for an athlete, we might not actually have major issues with glycogen depletion in that particular scenario. When you draw the line from the curve horizontally over to the y-axis to look at the distance, it's probably 30 miles is what at least this analysis or this modeling simulation suggests would be where an athlete would start to have major issues with running out of glycogen. This is modeling, it's simulation, it doesn't account for every variable. So I'm not saying that an athlete running at 70% of VO2 max will definitely not have a problem with low glycogen levels, but it's less likely in this particular example. Now, if you go 80% or 90% of VO2 max with that sort of typical relatively high carbohydrate intake, you still have a higher probability of hitting the wall before the marathon ends. It kind of ranges in terms of the distance here that the modeling is estimating where that's going to happen, but nonetheless, it'll happen before the end of the marathon. Now, what you see with that purple line, the top curved line, that's kind of maximal glycogen concentration. If we were to do something like 10 grams of carbohydrate for every kilogram of body mass, those are the kind of concentrations we're talking about. Even among high-level athletes who are exercising at 90% of VO2 max, the suggestion here is that they're not going to have a real high probability of running out of glycogen stores. Now, it doesn't mean that they shouldn't consume any carbohydrate during the race, or they're not going to have any problems with fatigue or hitting the wall. But it's less probable that low glycogen is the major cause of that athlete having issues towards the end of the race. Again, this is a simulation study. It's modeling. There are a lot of factors that go into fatigue, into whether or not a athlete, starts to have problems towards the end of the marathon, heat regulation, sleep, overtraining, lots of stuff going on to consider. So I don't want to look at this graph and give you a sense that it's just glycogen that matters, but it gives you a sense, at least for different calibers of athlete, how different levels of muscle glycogen and dietary carbohydrate are going to potentially impact their probability of hitting the wall during the course of a marathon due to low glycogen levels. Now, one other graph we'll look at here quickly is from a different study. And I just want to point out sort of the data and what they say about how much carbohydrate you would need to consume to sort of achieve maximal glycogen concentrations. So this is a pretty interesting study done in the early 2000s where they fed athletes for a few days, 10 grams of carbohydrate for every kilogram of their body mass. And they measured glycogen levels after a day of doing this and then after 3 days. And what you see here is after just 1 day or 24 hours, you've got a large increase in muscle glycogen levels with that high, very high intake of carbohydrate. And then when you go from sort of after 1 day to 2 days and then to 3 days, you don't really see a whole lot of further increase. You get most of the increase in the first 24 hours of sort of this glycogen loading protocol. So what it suggests is, number one, you don't have to do this for 7 days if you're going to be consuming a lot of carbohydrate in 1 day. And then the other thing here is that the maximal glycogen concentration among most people, if you look at the vertical axis, it's going to say around 200. Now, the units are a little bit different here than what we saw in some previous graphs from different studies. This is in millimoles of glycogen per kilogram of wet mass. So there's different ways to measure glycogen. Sometimes it's done dry mass, sometimes it's wet mass. To convert between the two, you would have to multiply wet mass times 4.3. If we do that for this particular graph, you end up with a little over 800 on the dry mass scale, which is similar to what we kind of saw in some of the previous studies as sort of a maximal glycogen concentration. There's going to be some individuals that may achieve more than that, may depend somewhat on the specific muscle you're looking at, but that's kind of an upper, sort of towards an upper limit with regard to how much glycogen you're going to be able to store. So 10 grams per kilogram of body mass of carbohydrate intake is going to be an amount that, for most people, saturates the muscle with glycogen. So as I close this video out, I want to summarize a few things in terms of the most important takeaways when it comes to carbohydrate loading and marathon performance. Number one, dietary carbohydrate intake is definitely going to impact muscle glycogen levels. When you consume a low amount of carbohydrate, let's say 2-3 grams per kilogram of body mass, that is the type of intake that is most likely to negatively impact an athlete's performance in the marathon. Now, it's going to impact a higher level athlete more than an athlete who's exercising at, let's say, 60% of their VO2 max during the marathon. But nonetheless, most athletes are going to run into some problems during the course of a marathon if they have that low of a carbohydrate intake. Now, more middle of the road intake, let's say 5 grams per kilogram of body mass, that may not be a problem for an athlete who's exercising at 65% or 70% of their VO2 max during the marathon. But for athletes who are pushing themselves harder, who are going for a PR, who are really, hitting it as hard as they can, that's still an amount that may not be enough for optimizing performance. And then finally, for our really high level caliber elite athletes, you probably want to be consuming at least 7 grams per kilogram of body mass, or more than that, sometimes upwards of 8 or 9 or 10 in some cases. Sort of depends on the athlete a bit. But you want to be in that territory of maybe 7 to 10 grams per kilogram of body mass per day. And maybe starting a couple of days before the marathon, doing that full amount for one day, maybe the day before the marathon, doing a little bit less just to avoid having so much food to go into your system. But nonetheless, over those couple of days before the marathon, you want to be consuming an adequate amount of carbohydrate to optimize your performance. Now, in this video, I've talked a lot about relative exercise intensity as a percentage of VO2 max. If you're not sure how to figure that out, or you want practical tips to be able to do that, check out the other video that I have posted that goes through some of the details of how you would actually calculate, what am I going to be exercising at as a percentage of my VO2 max during the course of my marathon.